Welcome to the Building Culture Podcast, where we explore holistic solutions to crafting a more beautiful, resilient, and thriving world through the built environment. I'm your host, Austin Tennell. I interview leading change makers, architects, developers, builders, engineers, entrepreneurs, inventors, and more. I also share my own journey as the founder of Building Culture as we grow a holistic real estate development company from the ground up. Together, we can explore a new vision for city building in the 21st century, one that puts people at the center. If you enjoyed this podcast or find value in what we're doing, please leave a 5-star review, share it with your friends, and drop us a note. Thanks for listening. Oh, there it starts going. Perfect. Okay, well, Shawn and Beth, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm excited to talk to you today. You know, I've really enjoyed working with your son, Thomas, over the past, I guess, 7 years now.
Yeah.
So I met him almost 7-8 years ago.
That's how we get known now, is through our children.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, you guys have quite the reputation yourselves. And I'm really interested to start off hearing about, you know, I know you bought, I believe it was 17 acres in Appalachia that Ohio had deemed as not fit for agriculture. And then over the past quarter century, you've transformed that land and produced, 95% of your own food and the food for the animals. And it's pretty much almost completely circular. Can you just talk about that journey and how in the world are you even doing these things? And why did they consider it not agricultural land?
Oh, well, if you saw it, you would see why. It's pretty obvious. It's very steep. We call it trees upside of the hill. And actually what we bought we say it only had a flat area the size of a swimming pool when we first bought it.
It only has a flat
that's
area
right, of the original farm that we bought. And we'd been looking for farm, trying to find a place to get out of the city. We knew we wanted that. And we wanted to have something that we could afford. And we didn't want to spend all our money or all our future money on land. So we finally, a neighbor of ours said, here's something that you guys might be interested in. And we went to look at it, and it was a disaster.
Just awful,
yes.
Austin. Picture squatters had been in it for about a year, ripped it up, left no trash service and no septic. Picture this for a minute.
Right.
No septic system, no trash. So that's what we're looking at.
They just thrown trash over the side of the hill, and
that's where the septic had gone too.
That's right. So it was really bad, but we thought at least we'd get out of the city, we'll flip it, and then we'll buy a real farm. And we had 3 children and one that was born in the process. But
we have 8 now. The 4th was just the one that was being born as we came on this property.
But we saw it as a recreational area. It was it had creeks, it had hillside, it had
it was a fun piece of property.
Yeah.
Relative to the not suitable for agriculture designation, what you have to remember is that it's all a question of how you define agriculture. And the state of Ohio defines it as something you do from the back of a tractor. This land is too steep and too small to be of interest to somebody who's going to manage it from the back of a tractor. Literally, there's less than an acre that you could comfortably take a 4-wheeled vehicle over. So that explains the designation. And that's actually true for a huge amount of northern Appalachia. It's steep. It erodes. It was actually farmland. It's easy to see that when you know how to read a forest. You can see that these are young, second growth or third growth forests. So back when people farmed with a mule, and farmed with their hands, this was indeed farmland. Although the piece we got is what was left after a farm was broken up and sold off. This was the piece that nobody could find a use for.
And so our expectations were very minimal. We wanted to kind of clean it up. So we were just going to cut the briars off. We didn't want to do it all by hand. So we got some goats, and they started us on that journey. And we put in a garden. We're going to do what we like to do.
Right.
So we were trying that stuff. And then our neighbor would allow us to use some of their property, which was a little bit less steep, not really much less steep, but we could.
And it was cleared, so it didn't have trees on it.
We ended up, we'd had the goats, we'd been milking the goats, we didn't really like the goat milk. We said, what about a cow? So we ended up getting, it's a long story, we ended up getting a cow that was not bred, and we had all that to learn. And, but then when we started milking the cow, we talk about 2 aha moments for us in terms of learning how to farm sustainably. And the first one was the dairy cow. Once you have that much milk coming in regularly, it transforms your farm. Because
what
now,
happens is, you know, if you start milking a cow, even if she's a very low production cow just eating grass, say you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 gallons of milk coming in the back door every day. By day 3, your refrigerator's full and you're trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do with this? And the answer, historically, for as long as humanity has kept domestic animals, including ruminants and non-ruminants, has been cows turn grass into milk, pigs and chickens turn milk into meat and eggs. And so the classic answer to what do I need when I have a dairy cow is I need a pig.
And so the cow really transformed us. And then, but we were just doing standard, typical grazing, turning the cow loose, letting it eat what it could eat. And it was eating on our neighbor's property and then eating a little bit of what we had. And we discovered that we'd run out of grass pretty fast. And then we were introduced to rotational grazing. And that was the second aha moment, that now we can feed a dairy cow eventually, all year round, by careful management of what it's allowed to eat, and then just keep it moving all the time. And the wonderful thing, and we talk about God's pattern, is that God created this system where grass will come in virtually anywhere. A ruminant will eat it, and that will improve the pasture. And so now, instead of being on a downhill cycle, you're on an uphill.
You're building complexity into the system again. The material world tends to go toward entropy, right? It gets less and less complex, but sunlight plus grass plus cows actually, or plus any kind of grass-eating, grass-converting animal like ruminant, actually builds energy into a system. That's counterintuitive for those of us who grew up in the Southwest or anywhere where conventional grazing, that is, turn the animal loose and don't move them around much. Let them choose where to graze. If you grew up close to that system, you're accustomed, if you were paying attention, to watching pastures degrade over time. That is, their biodiversity and their productivity goes down. The areas of poor forage or no forage get bigger. There's a reason for that. In nature, if you don't have sharp claws and sharp teeth and you taste good, you bunch together with all your pals so that numbers protect you against predators. And your capped bunch, say you're an antelope, right? You bunch with all the other antelopes because there are hyenas and lions and so forth prowling around you, picking off anybody who's dumb enough to stray out of the group. Well, if you stand and defecate on what you eat and you're hanging around with all your pals, you become migratory in about 15 minutes because what you're standing on is dinner. And once you've eaten it, you better keep moving. You don't want to eat where you've been. So it is in the nature of feral grazing herds, to move. And what does that do to the land? Well, it means that land gets grazed, manured, urinated, stomped, and rested. Now, interestingly, also intuitively, if you think about it, but interestingly, the non-woody ground covers, like grasses and legumes, benefit from grazing. It is in their best interest to be shorn off. Trees don't like to be shorn off. If you chop a tree down, it is seriously injured, killed, right? But if you chop grass off, what happens to your lawn? Next week, you have to mow it again. That's because the growth points for non-woody ground covers, like grass and legumes, and I'm just going to say grass from now on, their growth points are at ground level or very near that. So if the top growth does not get shorn off in some way, pretty soon it shades out its own growth points. Bunch grasses will actually, in many climates, they will die and leave a bare spot if nothing comes along to shear them off, either your mower or an animal that grazes them. So the picture we're trying to draw is of a natural world where areas that aren't trees are grass, some kind of non-woody ground cover, and that non-woody ground cover needs to be grazed, and the animals that are grazing it need to be migratory. The picture ends up being land is manured, so it is fertilized, it's rested, the plants regrow, that is, they take sunlight, carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, combine them to make complex carbohydrates, that is plant material, both underground in the form of roots and above ground in the aerial parts. They make more, and then the animal comes back and shears them off again. This is a giant biological carbon pump, shoving carbon deep into the ground where it provides fertility, aeration, food for the living biota that makes soil fertile and release the minerals in soil, and providing water retention. So this is basically a big natural system for abundance and health. We can copy it by using portable electric fence to move our grazing animals in those same patterns. In conventional grazing, the animals have no reason to bunch and migrate. We've eliminated their predators and we've put fence around them, so we're not worried about where they're going to go. We don't make them bunch and migrate. And they just spread out and eat their favorite plants. 3 days later, they start to regrow. They eat them again. They eat them again. They eat them again. They'll graze out the plants that they like a lot. Other plants that they don't like may shade themselves out. So we're moving backward. This is an entropy system. It's losing energy because we're killing off biodiversity and failing to capture the sunlight that we would otherwise capture and use to store carbon in the soil.
The other thing is that this really works on the small farm setting. It's much harder to do, and we find the big farmers don't really care.
In the U.S., I mean, there are places out west where you could graze huge herds, you yourself being on horseback and using humans and horses to provide the pressure for migration that was previously provided for by predators. You could do it, but in small farm systems, this has to be fairly small.
And that's part of what I want to talk about. What you're hitting on here with animals, is really comparing and contrasting, the industrial agricultural system to a more regenerative system. And so, for example, it's it's becoming increasingly mainstream that animals are terrible. Animals are terrible for the environment. Animals are terrible for humans, particularly cows. You can Google and find all sorts of articles on news websites about how terrible cows are and we shouldn't be, raising them anymore. And you guys are saying they're absolutely an essential ingredient to sustainable practices.
Can we follow that up for a minute?
I would love for you to, yeah.
Let's look at historical cropping compared to modern industrial cropping. Historically, when human beings have wanted to plant a crop and get it to grow, if they want to do it for more than a year or two, they have to find a way to restore fertility to that soil. Now, we just discussed the fact that fertility is built naturally into soil by periodic grazing and rest by grass-eating animals, right? So that historically has been the means by which human beings restored land to fertility. An example would be, say, medieval Europe having various lengths of cropping system. It might be a 3-year system, a 4, 5, 6, 7-year system of rotating crops with grassland, either grazed or mown for hay, but rotating crops with animals. Why? To restore fertility to the soil. That's what animals do. They would talk about sheep having golden hoofs, meaning that the action of sheep being grazed across land would restore it to fertility so that it can, again, produce a crop. I always think of this when I'm talking to, educated and well-meaning vegans and vegetarians, and sometimes I'll actually say it, which is if you had any idea how your food is being produced, you couldn't go on maintaining this cows bad, plants good narrative. Because in the modern world where we don't rotate animals with our crops, how do we put fertility enough in the soil so that we can grow the giant crops of whatever it is our vegan friends are eating? And we do it with non-renewable petrochemical fertilizers. We do it with, we come up with all sorts of other methods that look like they're not using non-renewable sources. Let me see if I can think of an example.
Mushroom compost that's
Right.
inputted.
So a perfect example would be we bought compost somewhere to spread on ground that we're going to grow vegetables on. First of all, the amount of ground you have to grow a varied plant diet is a lot bigger than people think it is. They're like, oh, I can have a garden out back. Yeah, it's not providing your staple carbs. It's not providing your mixed bean sources for proteins. But even leaving that aside, where's I going? Remind me. I blanked on you.
Yeah,
Austin.
I think how much land they need.
Oh yeah, where is that fertility coming from? Say I'm using compost that I brought in. Let's look at the sourcing for that compost. Well, okay, say it was litter from a chicken battery house. We've got to look at all the petrochemicals that went into the chicken feed, hauling the chickens, cleaning the battery house, building the battery house. If you want to see a short chain, sunlight to grass to cows to manured ground is about as short a fertility chain as you can ever get. And the ones that involve trucks and big equipment and chemicals taken out of the ground, those are going to be long fertility chains, and they're going to be the ones we can't keep renewing.
Yeah, you talk about how it in industrial practices, you actually have to put a whole lot more energy in than you get out.
Oh,
versus when
really,
you're, raising animals on grass and things.
People say there are 10 petrochemical calories in a calorie of food, and I think that's a modest guess. I think we're leaving stuff out of the loop, especially when you start reflecting on all of the secondary effects of our agricultural system. When we talk about, say, a calorie of people food in the grocery store took 10 calories to get there, let's look downstream. How many calories are we going to have to spend, say, trying to restore health in the person who's eating that one petrochemically derived and insufficient source of food? In other words, like our demineralized food is part of why we have the state of national ill health we do. And so there are costs downstream of our food system that wouldn't be there in a more holistic closed loop food system.
And I've got a follow-up question there on kind of the downstream effects, and not quite to the health yet, because I want to get to that. But,
okay.
What are some of the costs, and not human health yet, but some of the cost to industrial agriculture in terms of, one, the amount of fertilizer and things we use, and soil depletion, and then, of course, the way we do raise animals today? What is that doing to our environment? What are those costs that we as consumers, we go to the grocery store, we don't see any of those things?
It's definitely a forest for the trees question, Austin, when you think about it. The costs are all around us all the time in things that we don't see because we think they're normal, or we don't see because we fail to see they're a problem. Let me see if I can think of some examples. Okay, here's a little one. Because our cows graze on native pastures of small size with a lot of edge space, they edge onto streams, they edge onto ponds, they edge onto forest. There are many, many species available to our cows to graze. And because they have access to so many plant species, and they have the time generationally to learn those species, They maintain a very, very high degree of health on no meds, no wormers. The only mineral supplements they get are things like salt. Sometimes we'll give them kelp, but they're losing interest in kelp as their pasture knowledge grows, and they can provide their own mineral needs. And like we're talking infinitesimally small amounts of micronutrients that they can gravitate toward in native plants as they know them, right? Those plants are available to them, and they can maintain that health because our agriculture is on such a small scale. When you take 50 acres or 100 acres or 500 or 1,000 acres and you clear it of everything and you plant endless rows of corn and soybeans and some of the other crops that we grow on that scale, you've created this, you've taken an area that could be hugely biodiverse, right? It could, say, if it was, you'd have to go a little bit west of us to get land flat enough for this purpose. But it's land that would normally include hedges, streams, lots of edge space where ecosystems overlap and you get a very high level of biodiversity. You've cleared that, drained it, and planted it to one crop. You've deliberately eradicated the other crops and you planted it to one crop. And you don't have to have any imagination at all to be able to see that that one crop is not going to provide the health benefits for soil, animal, plant, microbe, everything that are very biodiverse small farms based on native plants.
My understanding, like soil depletion in the U.S. is a really big deal. We don't talk about it, but I've read things that there's only 30 or so turns, or I can't remember what they call it, and because we've depleted our soil so much just through our agricultural practices. Do you guys know much about that?
We had feet of topsoil in Oklahoma and
right,
areas
16 feet out in the Great Plains in some places was topsoil. Where did it come from?
And that's all gone down to just subsoil. So and that's gone.
It's interesting
we are not going to get 16 feet again. Now, what we hear is that topsoil can only be can only be developed 2 centimeters in 100 years or something like that, which is not true.
So it's all a question of your definition of topsoil, right? When we were kids and we, the 5 minutes that were devoted to ecology when we took science classes as a kid, we were told that it takes 100 years to produce an inch of topsoil. Well, what they really meant was it took 100 years for rocks to weather, to make that 1 inch of rock detritus, right?
But if basically naturally occurring topsoil.
That's if we define topsoil as what it really is, which is this largely organic mix of broken down living things that can build very quickly. And we can actually, there are places there's a farmer in New Zealand who uses a particular method of plowing and grazing where he says he can produce it, say, inches in a decade. And I don't doubt him. We've watched soil grow on our farm, on our rental farm, which used to be subsoil with about 1/2 inch of organic matter on top. When our son William had to build a cemetery on part of that pasture, and he had to use a blade to take off the top, at least the top 5 inches was topsoil. And that had grown since we started grazing that land in 2010, 2011. So it's just broken down organic matter. Well, the story we told earlier of grass and legumes growing, being grazed off, root dieback below the surface, we're taking carbon dioxide from the air, combining it with sunlight and water, and pumping organic matter into the soil in the form of roots. We build soil that way because every time the grass or the legumes are grazed off, some of those roots die back, leaving dead plant material underground to feed worms, to feed microbes, to feed fungi. And it breaks down, it composts, if you like, and becomes part of the topsoil. So our topsoil loss in the U.S., many people have speculated, and this has been the estimate for probably 25 years, a bushel of topsoil for every bushel of grain we're taking out of the Midwest. That's erosion carrying our topsoil, usually waterborne, sometimes airborne, but carrying it largely down into the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River. And that's a loss we can't go on sustaining. I mean, like, you can just sit and do some math and figure out fairly quickly that people who are eating today because we're growing wheat in Iowa can't count on going on eating from wheat grown in Iowa beyond a certain number of years because that soil's leaving us.
And if farmers would simply say, I need to improve the soil every year, that would absolutely dramatically change their practices, because they know they're depleting the soil. They know that they are, all you have to do is drive by it in the highways, the gray soil, and you know that it's going downhill. And if they said, I have to improve it, that would, their practices would have to change.
And to take the onus off the farmers, a little bit of history, easy to access if you read Wendell Berry attentively, but you can access it just by doing a search online too. Farmers didn't appeal to technology to show them how to farm. We didn't get to this point of mega industrial farm because farmers everywhere were saying, please save us from this thing. We have no idea how to make it work. We don't like our lives. But because as technology and industry develop, as we learn new things and acquire new tools, we tend to use them. And the companies that spend money on research and on building and selling technology and big equipment want to make money at it. So it's in their interest to say, boy, you need the tractor I'm selling you. It's so in after World War II, this is a good, easy history lesson. This one's a Wendell Berry history lesson. During World War II, the captains of industry with names like Ford, Rockefeller, got together and formed a thing called the Committee for Economic Development. And they, being the brilliant people who were at the top of our industrial economy, gave advice to the government about what needed to happen next. We're going to win this war. We've won it by being the source of most of the materiel that was necessary in Europe to fight this war. And we've done that by making huge factories and mobilizing a whole lot of people to work in them. And when the war's over, what happens to those factories? What happens to the fortunes that have been built by employing people in those factories and selling stuff from? What happens when we don't have a demand? When the government is no longer paying for tanks and meals ready to eat, right? So they made a recommendation, and this is easy to look up. You can find this documentation online. They called people units. They said, okay, when the war's over, it will no longer be necessary to have so many units in rural areas. We want those units in the city where they can have better lives working in the factories. So we have a recommendation to make. Now, up to that point, for about 50 years, the United States had the Farm Bill, which you sometimes hear about in the news, but you probably don't understand. And the Farm Bill has to do with how the government is going to interfere, for whatever reason, in the growing and marketing of crops. And up to that point, the job of the Farm Bill was to make sure farmers didn't go bankrupt. Because in a year where crops produce really well, say you and all your neighbors are raising wheat and you get a bumper year, that sounds like a win, right? Only the problem is if you've got a ton of wheat, there's not much of the price goes way down, right? There's a glut on the market. So it looks good because consumers get cheap bread, but the farmers don't get paid very well. Now, that might be okay if all the farms were small and mixed and people had other sources of income as well, like, say, jobs that they did in the wintertime. But as farms got bigger, If you had a good wheat crop 4 years running and so did your neighbors, you might go bankrupt because of your good wheat crop. And the Farm Bill had been put in place a little bit the way Joseph stored grain for Pharaoh in Exodus. The Farm Bill was put in place so that the government could make loans to farmers during years when crops produced very well and therefore brought a low price. There wasn't much of a market for them. The government would actually, it built granaries. It established a thing called the ever normal granary, which just means we're going to store some grain. One, so that we can take wheat or whatever the commodity is off the market temporarily so that the prices don't crash and the farms don't go bankrupt. And we have grain stored so that if the country hits bad years, we don't have a bunch of people starving. So the Farm Bill originally was there to prevent farmers going bankrupt and to keep the ever normal granary full. With the Committees for Economic Development, they said, we don't need so many people in the country anymore, so we have a proposal for you. Let's use the Farm Bill to bankrupt farmers. We're not trying to bankrupt. There were just then beginning to be industrial farmers. And of course, we don't want to bankrupt them because their owners are people with names like Ford and Rockefeller. And then there were people like us. No, not so much like us. There were the ones that they define them literally as the people who grow some food, but they also get government assistance. And they didn't mind those people. It was the people in the middle, the mid-sized family farm that actually made its living farming, that they wanted to drive into the city. They said, let's drop the bottom. Instead of establishing a price for wheat that would keep farmers in business and then giving them a loan against their wheat if the price drops below that, we'll drop that price to the point where it is going to bankrupt some of these farmers. They used the word unit, which made it look cleaner, but it was very clear. And so they did that. They made that recommendation to the government, and the government said, okay. They said, we want about a third of these farmers to go bankrupt. So they employed that at the end of World War II. And wheat prices were so low that indeed some large percentage of farmers were forced to sell up their farms and move to the city. It worked so well, in fact, that they did it for 5 years and it bankrupted something like, 13%. So they did it again. I think they ran that play at least 3 times very deliberately to send people into the cities. And so the choice for farms to become industrial, right, wasn't a choice at all, at least not made by the farmers. Many of these farmers, the ones who weren't forced into the city, were forced to try and get bigger and bigger and bigger so that tiny per unit profit they were making on their crops would add up to enough. If you're only making, 10 cents on a dozen eggs, you better produce a lot of eggs, right? So we ended up with big farms and industrialized farms because a choice was made on the government level and on the economic level, on the level of the big players in the economy, to pull the small farmers out of the picture. Now that sounds like conspiracy theory, only all you have to do is go back and look at the documents. So look up Committees for Economic Development and read some of the documents you find, especially around around 1944, 45, 46, and later, and you'll find that that's exactly what was going on. So that's just, it's a long way of saying we didn't choose to industrialize because it was a better way to farm. Farmers actually resisted industrialization, but it was forced upon them by economic necessity. And
that's been going on for a long, 80 years, because I hear, I'm not familiar with the agriculture industry, but I know, you see it in the news every year about how farmers are struggling still, farmers going out of business in the United States. That's we going to be able to produce enough food even for ourselves? Do you know much about kind of the current state of just agriculture in the United States?
I don't think we've looked this one up in 3 or 4 years, like since COVID. But I think in 2016, farmers passed military and law enforcement to corner the dubious honor of being the highest suicide rate in the country. The average age of the American farmer is about 60, which is also the average lifespan of the American farmer. That's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? Less than 1% at this point of the country claims farming as its income. Like if you were filling out something and say, what am I, right? Am I an engineer? Am I a teacher? Whatever. Less than 1% of the country would check the box that said farmer. And of those, less than 25% are making a living at it. That is, they don't have to subsidize that from some other source. Most of the people, like, if you drove out to Kansas and you picked a random acreage, if you weren't standing on a huge industrial farm, you'd be standing on the farm of a guy who probably busts his backside half the year, but his wife works in town so that they have health insurance.
And I serve on the soil and water for Jefferson County here in Ohio. And it's clear when they look forward that the solution is not to establish small farms, but the solution is robot tractors or bigger pieces of property, larger ways to do this, so that the solution,
more fertilizer, more chemicals.
Absolutely. Right. More, they will say we're getting smarter about how we use fertilizer, which I think they're not going back to the animal. That would be really smart to do something like that. But they're just, they're no-till, which means that I have to use glyphosate to deal with weed pressure. I mean, when you're on that scale, you are forced to use fertilizers and glyphosate and all those things. You can't farm the way that we farm on 1,000-acre farms.
Right. For example, in our staple crop garden, so we have about an acre in staple crops, potatoes, various things we feed the pigs. We restore fertility to most of that land by pasturing chickens over it. And you couldn't, where are you going to get the chickens to run over 1,000 acres? And then where do they go when you don't need them? Whereas we can just move them onto, we're actually usually fertilizing about a third of the land every year, and the chickens just get moved. It's very difficult to, if you think about the fact that there's like a normal size for human beings, and you couldn't make a giant human being and take care of it because we have a proper size. Farms are like that. They are organisms. They're ecological organisms that can get too big and no longer function well.
Yeah, I talk about that because that's a corollary to, well, a lot of things. Building, I use a Leon Creer anecdote a lot where he talks about how biological organisms, they grow until maturity and then they stop growing, and then the way they continue growing is through reproduction. And then he compares that to the city. Rather than an ever expanding city, there really is an ideal kind of size or range of size. It's not like necessarily, hey, this one thing,
right?
But cities should grow until maturity, and then they should replicate and duplicate and then be connected. And actually, in your paper that I read before hopping on here, you point out that I think Wendellberry refers to farms as neighborhoods, which I thought was really interesting because he's getting at the complexity of what happens on a true farm, which is also interesting because that's how I think in the built world about what a neighborhood should be, versus we've done the same thing in building where we've distilled all the ingredients down that make up a neighborhood and then spread them out over, different distances. And so we've got subdivisions of just like all there are, $300,000 houses that are 3-bedroom, and that's all that is in that subdivision. And then we put, everything else all around. And it's very similar, this industrialization of our lives, our everyday lives, whether it's through farming or building or our work. I find it interesting because it's culturally driven in so many ways, and manifests itself in all sorts of different industries.
Right. And when we were trying to talk about, since we leapt into this conversation sort of in the middle, we weren't being as linear as I'd like to be in telling the story of the industrialization of agriculture. I think from listening to my son Thomas, who's your here in
He heads up urban
agriculture.
design. Yeah.
That's right. I don't know why it never occurred to me until he pointed it out, to see how our built environment is so directly the product of the petroleum industry, of what has arisen out of becoming a petroleum driven economy. It wasn't that we chose to have, we said, oh, we need interstates, right? But that we chose cars as they became available, and then let the fact of cars dictate everything that followed, rather than having a need for them and changing our environment to meet that need. It's
Right.
the
A
car
human first
system
approach where you use the car as a tool versus it was decided to use the car. And now really we're slaves to the car, even though every commercial tries to make it equate car and freedom. And I get that. And when cars were first invented, there was a very real aspect to that. Get in your car and go drive out into the country. How amazing is that? I mean, that's just unbelievable what you can do with agriculture or work or construction. They're incredible tools. But then now you cannot survive in the vast majority of the United States without a car. And frankly, one car, good luck. You know, if you've only got one car, you know, what are your kids going to do? What are your, you know, if both of you work, I mean, you're it's really, really, really. And then I read this recently, the average cost of car ownership now is a little over $12,000 a year.
Wow.
Right.
You know, so it's just
I've read
the economic burden.
The first 3 months of your year, your income is simply servicing your vehicles. 25%.
Right. And then we still in our heads, we're thinking it means freedom, kind of like our industrial agriculture, where we think, hey, we don't have to think or worry about food at all. It's a very temporary, narrow window where we can kind of get away with it, as you guys point out. And I think this is a good, as we talk about kind of in some of these industrial practices, also the downstream effects of human health, because, you know, as the soil gets more depleted, then we're relying on fertilizers and glyphosate, you know, that's illegal in Europe and a known carcinogen and all that. And I've read that you can squeeze a strawberry and they can actually, I don't know, I think that some kind of chemical pulls up in just conventional strawberries, which are one of the dirty dozen or whatever. I have a question. I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember when I read Michael Pollan's book a long time ago, he talks about how, you know, cows have rumens, which allows them to digest grass. Unlike humans, we can't digest grass. But he talks about how the rumens are neutral, their pH level is neutral. But because we grow cows on corn, feed cows corn in this country, it actually turns their rumens acidic, which then eats through the kind of the stomach lining of the rumen and gets out into the bloodstream, which then precipitates feeding them antibiotics to keep them from actually getting sick. Do you know if that's I don't know why that stuck out to me like over 10 years. It's just like, it was so kind of jaw dropping to me at the time. Is that true?
So it's even a bigger picture than that. Ruminants, animals with 4-chambered stomachs that can digest cellulose, are of vital importance on a planet where all life energy is some form of sunlight, but most, in other words, is plant material, right? We have photosynthesizing plants. They capture sunlight, they turn it into plant material, and that's the source of energy for virtually every other living thing on the planet, right? But interestingly, although cellulose is 70, 80, 90% of most plant parts, or most plants and plant parts, cellulose is indigestible to the macro animals. Cellulose is digestible to bacteria, but you can't break it down. It passes through your body and you call it fiber. Most animals cannot break it down. Ruminants can't themselves. They lodge, that is, they host cellulose digesting bacteria in their rumens. And as long as that's the primary source, so what that means is that they make accessible in the form of milk, meat, or manure, they make accessible to all the other macrofauna that can't digest cellulose. They make the energy of cellulose accessible. It's like magic. So if you look out at a wheat field, for example, and you harvest the wheat, You can digest the grain, but by far and away the larger part of that plant is straw, which you can't digest, but you can feed it to an ox, and you can eat the ox, you can milk its mama, and you can pull a wagon or a plow with the ox. That cellulose becomes available to feed and do work for human
You're
beings.
producing energy.
That's right. Well, if you take instead and feed carbohydrates like the wheat to the ruminant, a bunch of things change. In the first place, you're missing that huge opportunity that ruminants provide, which is that we can access the 80% or 90% of plant energy out there.
Which is free.
Which is free. It's just sunlight. Grass grows, sun shines, grass grows, cows eat it, and suddenly all that cellulose that your land wanted to produce anyway becomes available to you as milk, meat, manure, and work, labor, traction, right? Well, as soon as you start feeding carbohydrates to ruminants, you've not only lost all that free energy, but you have changed the way that you've changed the mix of flora and fauna in the cow's rumen. The pH goes down, and not only does that mean the cow's gut is going to process nutrients differently. We've all, at least if you're a mom, you've heard of leaky gut syndrome, because
we've heard of it too, because
this introduces us to the whole realm of modern health problems, including psycho-health, right? So we moms who are accustomed to, say, contemplating the possibility that our children will be somewhere on the autism spectrum, will have learning disabilities, will have serious health problems, we're thinking about guts, and we're familiar with the idea of leaky gut. And when we feed inappropriate foods to cows, and among other things make their rumens acidic, it's not surprising that we would expect to see results of that as ill health in cows, and then we'll respond to that with antibiotics, which will then do two things at least. It'll put antibiotics in our food stream, and it will result in antibiotic-resistant pathogens. But on top of that, we're going to start experiencing health problems. A simple one would be to say that when cows' rumens got acidic, we started to see more of, now, people say E. coli like they're saying something bad. E. coli is Escherichia coli, and there are, I forget, 200 varieties of Escherichia coli. Only a few of them are any problem whatsoever to people. But one of those is E. coli 0157H7, and that's the one that's usually associated with nasty food outbreaks. E. coli 0157H7 or Listeria or some of the Clostridiums. Staph, those are a danger to us, like E. coli 157H7, because it is acid tolerant, because of the acidic gut of the cow's rumen, and therefore our stomachs don't kill it. Our stomachs are acid. It can survive through our stomachs, lodge in our intestines, and that's when we begin to get sick. So this tinkering with biology, this treating it as though
it's a machine.
Yeah, as though the living universe is a machine and we can just substitute parts and energy sources with no secondary effect. Well, intuitively, we know that's not going to be true, but we also see it work out in practice in, as you say, things like acidic cow guts lead to cow problems, which lead to too many antibiotics in use, and also leads to pathogenic bacteria in our food streams.
Plus growing the corn and all the chemicals we put in the corn, then we're feeding that into the cow, and then that's getting concentrated in the meat. I can't remember. I remember reading it gets pretty concentrated in meat, all those chemicals
absolutely.
and fertilizers.
Well, and then we're genetically modifying these things so that the corn can actually attack the bugs that would be hurting them, but they say, don't worry,
it won't affect you.
It won't affect you. It's all fine. And anybody who's thinking would say, how would it only attack the bugs and not affect humans as well, or cows or whatever?
Yeah, that is
we've oversimplified the way we think and talk about things. And because we've also distanced ourselves from the things themselves, like grass, fields, cows, animals, our food sources, we fail to catch the fact that we're oversimplifying. And it's funny for the three of us to sit here and try and elucidate and clarify what the problem is, when in fact what we're talking about is an ocean of problems which are all tied together and interacting with one another. And the solution is actually to I don't want to say go backward, but is to look at the nature of what Wendell Berry calls neighborhoods, we'll say, like an ecosystem, and say we have two options in dealing with an ecosystem. We can honor it as a beautifully tuned and balanced and beautifully resonant set of I don't even want to say set of systems. It's this living thing that can respond to change. And then we move in and we treat it. We either treat that reverently, we can honor it as what it is, and make our interactions suggestions, right? I will propose that this ecosystem can, say, produce wheat for me, but I won't force it. I'm not going to bulldoze it. I will make sure that whatever I do here doesn't disrupt the ecological systems that are present, things like its ability to process sunlight and rainfall. Or we can come in and say, I understand this completely. I know what I want from this system. I'm going to erase what's here and park what I want here and make it produce what I want. If you plowed 100 acres and planted wheat on it and got a wheat crop and said, okay, I want to keep doing that indefinitely, about year 3, you'd have to start shoving petrochemicals underneath that wheat to get it to grow. And, in a short period of time, you'd end up with the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. You'd have a problem, right? Whereas if you come into an ecosystem and observe what it does well and help it to do those things well, and learned by, the human race is here because the human race is good at learning this, learned by observation how what that ecosystem wants to do can also produce food for humans.
And the abundance that you get is tremendous. That's what we have loved, and it has led us to a deeper relationship, I think, with God, that we see.
Oh, I hear you.
Okay.
Great.
that this that we have a pattern, that if we will follow that pattern, we get an abundance, things improve. It's it's really beautiful.
I think that's such a great point. I'd like to talk about this for a little bit because, when I was reading your stuff, I was seeing that this vision of, it's one, respecting the limitations of the world, and I think you call it
Right.
biomimicry. Am I saying that word right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, versus force. And once again, I can tie this back to architecture. I kind of think it in the same way of, we assume we completely understand. We try to detach ourselves from all of human history and how we've lived and just say, we're going to live like this. And it doesn't work.
Right.
And you can see it in the data and the stats and people's misery levels and health levels and all sorts of stuff and the breakdown of community. But increasingly popular today is this idea of we don't live in an abundant world, that it's a very finite world. And that, especially with young people, my generation, I'm 35 and under, like, oh, we're just all screwed.
Right.
And while I think there's a whole lot of problems with the world, don't get me wrong, I don't think that's fundamentally true, though. I think that, like what you're saying, is when we actually respect kind of nature and the way things work, it doesn't mean we don't shape them. Just like you were saying, hey, animals used to graze and the predators. And now we can kind of mimic that with electric fences, right? And that is an intervention, but once again, it's an intervention that's comes from a place of understanding the world and how it works and respecting that, and then also and then applying your own methods to mimic that. Or in the case of architecture, I could say, or you can even enrich it. I think you said that
Yes.
that man can actually improve the world, can improve the farm, can improve the forest, whatever it is, can make it better, that we're not just destructive creatures. I mean, there is a lot of destruction, but the opposite is absolutely possible.
Absolutely. And you can see it. So an easy example, I think, would be the ecology. So in nature, energy tends to follow boom and bust cycles. And the example that was used when we were kids taking biology had something to do with the study that had to do with grass, snowshoe hares, and Arctic foxes, right? And so grass grows, and as long as there's plenty of grass, the snowshoe hares reproduce, and the Arctic foxes, which hunt snowshoe hares, also reproduce because everybody has plenty to eat. At some point, when the population of snowshoe hares exceeds the available grass, you don't get a bunch of skinny snowshoe hares who somehow limp along until the season gets better. You get a crash in the population. They don't plan ahead and say, oh gosh, it looks like there's not enough grass to get us through the winter on normal rations. Everybody eat less this winter. They just eat until they run out of grass. Their population crashes. The fox population crashes, which gives the grass a chance to recover. And then the snowshoe hare population starts to grow again as there's more grass, right? So we have abundance of food, abundance of herbivore, right? Abundance of predator, until the abundance of food crashes, then the herbivores crash, then the predators crash, and it starts over. It's a pendulum swing. It's a boom-bust cycle. And it works. Ecologies have existed under those conditions for millennia, but it's messy, and human beings have a rather natural objection to partaking of boom and bust population crashes. We don't like to suddenly see a population of 10,000 human beings become a population of 5 or 3 or 2,000 human beings because they starved. It's uncomfortable. It's not beautiful. But when we bring our intellect, so the example on the farm we would give is on the 30 acres of grass we manage at the rental farm, we tend to carry somewhere between 8 and 10 brood cows and a bull, and their calves and their yearlings. Every winter or every fall, we look at the amount of grass that we're going to be able to stockpile for the winter, that is ungrazed pasture that we know we can carefully graze the animals across over the winter to make sure that they get through the winter with enough to eat. We have to look at the number of animals that have been born on the farm. So what's our total? Because every year there are about 8 more calves. What's our total? And how many animals need to be taken off the list so that the grass we have matches the number of animals we have. The amount of grass we have is something that's hard for us to manipulate. We could buy in hay, but right now we're talking about how would we do it if we couldn't. So we have to look at the food source. Primary food source is always going to be plants. And then say, how many animals can that feed? And reduce our animal populations to that number, or maybe a little bit less to give ourselves some wiggle room. As long as we do that responsibly, harvesting animals for food or selling animals off the farm to be brood animals on somebody else's farm, we can match our ruminant numbers to the available grass, and the ruminants will feed us, feed the soil, reproduce, and we've got a good system going. Every year there's more grass, there are more ruminants, but within a certain ecological limit, and the human beings get fed.
And
we can make it better.
There's lots of decisions that are made on the farm, and the primary consideration has always got to be the soil. That is this improving the soil, or is this degrading the soil? And if every choice is about improving the soil, that's got That's got to be where we start, is that every choice is improving the soil. Then there are other considerations, of course, but if we are degrading the soil, that's a management problem that we need to correct.
It's like spending your capital or eating your seed grains, right? As long as what we do, what we eat, what our animals eat, what gets sold off the farm, allows for an increase in fertility in the soil, we're operating this in a stable system. But the minute what we're doing is actually eating away at our soil fertility, we're moving in a negative direction, and that's got an obvious end in time. It's what the nation's been doing for over 100 years, but more and more.
It's extractive.
That's right.
Yes, it's mining.
It's
hysterical. I
mean,
and
it's interesting.
It'd be funny if it wasn't appalling,
right?
That we live in a nation where more than 99% of us, we all eat generally 3 meals a day, and more than 99% of us take it on faith that there will be food to eat tomorrow, when all the facts indicate the reverse. When you can tell
actually,
people,
I had that specifically. I wanted to ask you because I think you said we are teetering on the edge of famine. You said that. Can you talk about that? Like what do you mean by that specifically?
Well, everything is so precarious. We are on a knife blade in terms of fragility in our food system. And we saw that when COVID hit. We saw that with hurricanes, that when you stop moving food, and our son was just telling us about this. He's on a base in South Dakota, an Air Force base, and he is the health officer. And he's been trying to Air Force, and
I'm just saying, careful, don't compromise James in anything we say. He was a little bit careful about what he said.
Okay. He was talking about being prepared for what would become
interruptions in supply
chain.
Right.
And he was trying to help them see that based on their system, how they are doing this.
Don't give numbers.
I don't have the numbers. Yeah. Based on this, he would say that very limited time would be available
for correcting the problem. Right.
And he's trying to get them to see that. But this is everywhere in the United States that we saw, again, with the hurricanes, we saw that where as soon as you break down the driving system,
that's right,
food stops.
If you were only looking at transportation, you could see that the minute our highways aren't arteries for nutrients to move along, for whatever reason, most places are going to be without food. What's the nationally accepted number is like 3 days, right? How can people possibly be comfortable with the thought that if something interrupted their supply chains, they'd be in trouble in 3 days? But we are comfortable because we're just because
we've never really experienced the consequences.
Yes,
COVID was a little bit of a wake-up call.
In the face of things we think we can't change, we very rightly, almost faithfully, hand that worry over to the Almighty. Even if you're an atheist, you've got to be accustomed to saying, that's too big a problem for me to worry about. And then your comfort must be that somehow, somewhere, something else is going to take care of that problem.
The experts.
That's right. The experts,
something of the
government.
Kind. Right.
Something.
Maybe that's your God. So when we talk about teetering on the edge of famine, we could focus that in a lot of different places. We could look at the transport, at petroleum and shipping. We could look at the fragility of the internet, of our IT, and how much of, I think that one of the scenarios our son was talking about was what would happen if we had a security breach in our IT. What shuts down, and what shuts down downstream of that because something upstream shut down. And it was huge. We could focus, for example, on the fact that our soils are we're losing our soils. The soils that are still here are losing productivity. They're only productive in the commercial world if we have access to a whole lot of chemicals that have to be shipped across the country. So if any
shipped
part
across
of this,
the world,
you break one link in that chain and the chain is broken, there's no tension in the chain. It no longer functions. But you could also turn to human health. Shawn and I are in our early 60s. So our memories span the years from cancer was a scary word that was uncommon, right? We knew about it, but you didn't see it much. Autism was an unknown word. Food allergies were rare. They existed, but like in a student body of say 60, your standard Catholic grade school with 2 homerooms of 4th graders, right? 60 kids. You might have one kid in there who came out in spots if he ate strawberries. You might have 2 little boys who had trouble sitting still. You might have one tubby boy and one tubby girl. And you could look at their families and say, well, that's probably genetic. What do we have today? Right? And you'd have one asthmatic kid. Now let's look at how common among those 60 kids today, how many of them would be obese? How many of them would be diabetic? None of them would have been back then. How many of them would have food allergies or be somewhere on the autism spectrum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our lives have spanned from when those conditions were rare to now when they are so common and becoming more common all the time. That's probably due to a lot of things, environmental, behavioral, but also the food system. And it doesn't really matter where they're coming from if we don't know how we're going to deal with it. Even if you simply look at the fact that as we move into being a population of people who have more and more trouble just functioning, who's going to do the work that puts food on our table? If farmers live to be 60 on average, and if the average farmer today is 60, next year, who's going to be growing whatever people are eating? Those are questions.
You're touching on something really important to me, that because I talk about this at building culture of, because the mission of building culture is really to build a thriving world for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very holistic thing. And one of that is human health. So that manifests itself in, when we're building houses, we're trying to do air quality things and certain types of materials and staying away from harsh chemicals and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think about it because we hear all the time about dying trades and the young people aren't going to trades. Although I did read a recent Wall Street Journal article that there's increased interest in trade among young people, which is great, but kind of a similar thing with construction and agriculture where the age is fairly high, the average age. And I'm saying it's not just a matter of we need to get more people in the trades, blah, blah. I mean, the trades and trade work or agriculture work is very difficult, very physically demanding. And so you actually literally need healthy people to be able to do that. And as you're saying, our population is going just wildly downhill in terms of physical health. My sister and I both grown up with autoimmune issues that we were constantly, that's what turned me on 12 years ago or maybe even longer to eating healthy, was trying to deal with my own health. And that's, but that's just increasingly becoming true. Like you're saying, among kids with diabetes and obesity and all sorts of cancer and all sorts of other chronic, I think it's like 60% of Americans have lived with chronic diseases now. And you cannot have a productive society when people can't even work,
Right. And yet we're not hitting the panic button. We're going right on down the same road. Let science tell us how to fix this. Somebody will come up with a quick fix before we hit the brick wall. The problem appears to be so big that we'll let the people who've been driving go on driving, hoping that somehow we're not going to crash. But it would be remiss to sit here and the 3 of us don't actually need to be convinced that this is a mess. And we don't have to be convinced that there are natural, holistic methods that would be better. What would be important, Shawn's been working on this for a symposium we'll be doing at Hiram College in a couple of weeks. And we'll be addressing a lot of college-age kids. And we're trying to ask ourselves and help them to ask, like, what's the upside? Like, how do we turn this into a cheerful picture? And the cheerful picture, I'm sure you have an equivalent like this when it comes to architecture, that there are some really, maybe not simple fixes, but you can have good human built environments with some fairly simple principles. And the same goes for farming. If you live in even a degraded place now, as Appalachia is largely degraded from, say, hilltop.
If you can take our place and turn it into a farm, you can do this anywhere.
Right, or almost anywhere. And the fact is that a couple of semi-able-bodied adults who like working outside and will devote about, a third to a half of their time seasonally in and out, sometimes a lot less than that, so occasionally more, to simple ecological management, mostly using herbivores to harvest what the land wants to grow anyway, and help using those herbivores to help the land do that better. You can actually produce. We started out, you were describing our farm and saying that, as is in fact the case, we produce 90 to 95% of our own food and our animals' food and the fertility in our soil. And it's noteworthy that 5 or 10% that we don't produce is almost all luxury. Coffee, tea, sugar. The wine that we don't produce ourselves and we do drink, that's bought. We buy beer. I haven't figured beer making out. We buy, some things are necessary. We buy salt. Right now, we buy our wheat from a local farmer. We have grown our own wheat. It's an intensive. It's not difficult. It's a fairly intensive thing to do. And what we mostly do is substitute potatoes for the primary starch in our diet. Where Americans tend to eat a lot of wheat, we eat a lot of potatoes. But we can grow everything we need, or virtually everything we need, on quite a small acreage, while that acreage continues to get better at expressing its ecological individuality, growing in fertility, growing in its ability to store precipitation, rainfall, as drought protection, as flood protection. We can live on the land, make it better. It will get better at feeding us. Our health will improve as the biodiversity increases, because biodiversity equals more available micronutrients and phytochemicals. And we can do that not by, we have this myth about our ancestors living this, brief, bloody, fraught existence, barely getting by, which is an interesting myth, considering that we're also proposing that they worked about 10 times as hard as we do. But in fact, farming, almost anywhere, the closer you live to the tropics, the less farming you have to do in general, and the more food you can just harvest full time, because you have plants producing fruit and seed year round. As you live further and further away from the tropics, you get seasonality. You do have to harvest more of your food during the spring, summer, and fall, but you get winters off too, right? You aren't doing that much work. So there is this myth that we have to, get up before the sun gets up and fall into bed after dark and do it every day just to get by, is exactly that. It's a myth. The good news is, you can, if you make your demands on a piece of land reasonable, it will give you food and health and leave you time for other things.
And improve.
And get better at it all the time. And that's the message more than any other thing that we've spent the last 14 years trying to put into print and to speak in public. And then occasionally people like you put it out on the internet as well. That there's this scary story we're telling ourselves. It's a story of dearth, of lack, of competition, of human beings being bad, of cows being bad. And it's not a true story. We can, you can live a really lovely life taking care of a few cows and sheep and planting seasonal gardens and helping water to stay on a piece of land long enough to percolate into the ground. And doing that with your family and your friends and your neighbors, and having time left over to work a paying job just as little as you can possibly manage, so you have enough money to pay your taxes and put gas in the car, but as long as we were having this conversation this morning, that everything the average city dweller in the United States does, including flush the toilet, costs him money. So anytime he perceives his life to need some kind of an overhaul, he has to see that overhaul in terms of, for me to do that, I have to make more money than I'm presently making. Whatever I'm making isn't enough to fix my life, and I need to figure out how to make more. That's a very scary and depressing picture.
And we've spent an awful lot of our life trying to figure out, how do you get out of the money system?
That's right.
And it's been a great, we do a lot of barter. We raise our own, we heat our own house. We do an awful lot of things that are completely not a part of the cash system. So that means that I don't have to work off farm to bring in cash to pay for those things. And we can just live from the farm.
And some people think that looks like, well, then you just have to bust your backside doing dirty labor all the time. And the fact is that an hour before we started talking to you, we were fixing our composting toilets, which some people think they'd rather be dead than use or fix. But we have really comfortable, our son is across the room, he just said, true. He'd rather not fix that toilet. But we have, in our household economy, our farm economy that doesn't use a lot of cash, we have leisure and creativity and beauty and time together. And I think this is a real significant thing. We get to make a lot of decisions, way more decisions than I used to make when I was a wage slave. Then most things were forced upon me. You have to be at work at this time. You have to do this kind of work. You have to wear these kind of clothes. You're going to have a hard time feeding yourself other than from the store. Now we get to make a lot of choices about our life. And
we've taken ownership of an awful lot of things like education.
Yeah,
we've
right.
homeschooled, we've home birthed. We home an awful lot of things. We home food, we home storage.
Don't tell the man.
Yeah. And just being in control of all that allows us to make the choices for the best food. And there's nobody who eats better than we do. You couldn't buy the food that we have at our home. It's not available.
It's an interesting thing that eating really, really high quality, nutrient dense food is one of the few pleasures I know of. I can think of at least one or two others that does not grow pale with repetition. We get used to wearing comfortable clothes, keeping our houses at ambient temperatures that please us, right? And you cease like the occasional breeze standing under the apple tree when it's really hot out and I'm sweaty is delightful, but sitting in an air-conditioned room is not. Food, really good food, is delightful 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year in, year out. It never pales. We sit down, we have a fairly limited diet. It has to be stuff that grows here in this corner of Appalachia.
It's meat and potatoes. That's not so bad.
Meat and potatoes and 4-season salads and a lot of, we don't grow huge varieties of things. We eat the same things over and over. And no kidding, we sit down at the table, no matter how old the person at the table is, we all have the same, this is so delicious response 3 times a day. It's a good life.
I think that's a really beautiful way to end, and I even like that you calling it the story we tell ourselves. That's a myth that we've been telling ourselves. It's not true, and I think that's where we really agree. And even with what building culture is doing, is this idea of telling a new story, and that it's not about these big events, the annual vacation once a year. It's
Yeah.
how do you incorporate more beauty and delight into
Yes.
everyday life?
Right.
Because life isn't about the big events. There's a whole lot of kind of boring and mundane space in between,
Right.
but it doesn't have to be those boring and mundane, because you can have delights, daily things that are smaller, that you're more mindful of. And the other thing that I've really found that gives me hope, because I'm young, 35, I've got kids, and one of the reasons I'm interested in all this is because I think a lot of the things we're talking about we're going to start seeing a lot of the consequences within my lifetime, and
Yeah.
especially in my kids' lifetime.
Right.
So that's why I'm really pretty passionate about this stuff. But the other really cool thing about it is just like you guys and your family, my the team that I work with and stuff, whether it's Tom or Matt, the other guys, uh, and even collaborators. There's as things kind of go wrong in one way, there's also this kind of countercultural movement on the other side, and it's like a band of people like fighting for something, and that gives meaning to it, and
Right.
relationships, and
It's getting
so it's not like I go
easier.
through life going, oh my gosh, it's all terrible, it's all
Yeah.
horrible. I can actually see these things as major problems.
Yes.
But then I'm thankful people like you are out there. I'm not working in agriculture, but I'm thankful you and other people out there are working in agriculture,
Right.
and then same for us in the built environment. And yeah, so I really love what you're doing and in your message, and I appreciate your kind of pioneering spirit too.
I think you put that so well. This is a really, really fun time to be alive. The minute
Yeah,
the
that's a good way
challenges
to say it.
the minute the challenges become not something beyond our ability to analyze or address, and become challenges that we can answer every day with everything we do, we can be making a choice for life and growth and health instead of helplessness.
And we're seeing, especially in the homesteading movement, other people uh, branching off and taking off in one direction, and we love to follow where they're leading, because they're doing some really exciting work as well. I mean, ours is the dairy cow, and we're very excited about that. But as other people are branching off, and we can start following and watching what they're doing, and then try and incorporate that into our work, it's an exciting time.
This is a battle in which everybody's invited to join whichever side they prefer and fight for it. And that's a really fun place to be, because our army's growing all the time. Every time somebody says, this food stinks and I'm going to do something about it, and goes out back and plants a tomato, the army grows, our information grows. It's a great time to live. I hope
I love it. That's a
I hope all of our kids get to, um, I hope we're grabbing hold soon enough that our kids can get even further than we can. I hope we're stopping the backward slide, and beginning to build momentum in a good direction. I think we are.
yeah, I think so too. Well, where can people? I've got the Independent Farmstead, your book that I'll also put in the show notes. Where I forget your blog. Where can people follow along with what you're doing?
One Cow Revolution.
But we're
One
really
Cow Revolution.
we have a very small online presence.
But
Farming is an extremely local thing, and the best thing people can do is get a few principles down, what we would call patterns, and then go out back and try it. Go next door and invite the neighbor to come help. You're going to learn the most by gathering some principles and then getting out there and doing it.
We are on YouTube a lot.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of people who have videotaped us and stuff like that. We're not good at that, but people have done that. So if you just do a Google for Shawn and Beth Dougherty, you'll find
a lot of stuff comes out.
Right.
Okay. Well, Beth, Shawn, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And I look forward to keeping up with what you guys are doing.
Great. Thanks for having us, Austin.
All right. Bye.
There we go.
Bye.